Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to retired General Robert Brooks Brown, the former commander of U.S. Army Pacific, about why China no longer fears the U.S. military and how Congress's short-term spending bills hurt the defense industry and hamper U.S. innovation. And then we break down all of the drama around the Signal group chat that sparked major high-stakes questions for the Trump administration. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A really good show for you this week. I'm coming to you from Huntsville, Alabama, where I've been attending the Association of United States Army's Global Force Symposium here, and I'll have an interview coming up later in the show with retired General Robert Brooks Brown, the former head of U.S. Army Pacific and now the president of AUSA. So stay tuned for that. But Guy, before we get there, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here with you on the podcast for another week. Right now, I'm trying to unpack how this week's annual testimony to Congress by the Trump administration's intelligence chiefs on the top threats facing the United States was essentially sidelined by the revelations that top administration officials, from Pete Hegseth to Tulsi Gabbard, Vice President Vance, CIA Director John Radcliffe, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and a slew of others engaged in the now notorious group chat on Signal, the encrypted commercial communications platform, and how Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, was somehow added, apparently inadvertently by Mike Waltz, to this chat in which Pete Hegseth essentially gave an hour-by-hour, blow-by-blow of a recent U.S. military attack on Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen before the attack had actually happened. Waltz, Hegseth, Ratcliffe, Gabbard, note, Ben, she is the director of national intelligence, all deny that classified information was shared on this chat. But I have to say, Ben, with more than 20 years experience covering the U.S. intelligence and national security communities from this side of the mirror as a journalist, this chat, which has now been published by The Atlantic, really feels like it was actually chock full of classified information. We could debate that and the political hysteria over all of this that's emanating from Democrats, especially for the whole podcast. But I want to just look at a couple things that I think haven't gotten enough attention here. Ryan Lovelace, our lead national security tech correspondent at Threat Status, has been all over this. And we published a report of his on March 26, highlighting how CIA Director John Radcliffe responded to questions at a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing that day about why he and other top Trump administration advisors were having this sensitive conversation on Signal in the first place. Radcliffe said, quote, "One of the first things that happened when I was confirmed as CIA director was Signal was loaded onto my computer at the CIA," end quote. He added that that's the case, quote, "for most CIA officers," end quote. This really revealed for the first time, Ben, the extent to which American spies have apparently adopted Signal. Radcliffe notably also testified that the Trump administration had approved use of the platform for communication and coordination, so long as any actual decisions made in those communications were then recorded through former channels. Here's the thing, Ben, and we highlight this in Ryan Lovelace's reporting. Russia-linked hackers are suspected of trying to compromise Signal's tool for linking multiple devices to a single account. And China's Typhoon hackers are also focused on penetrating the American telecom sector to get inside people's phones. All of this is pretty well documented in publicized U.S. intelligence assessments. So, revelations actually about Russia's efforts emerged in February when Google put out a report saying that it had, quote, observed increasing efforts from several Russia state aligned threat actors to compromise Signal messenger accounts used by individuals of interest to Russia's intelligence services. End quote. It doesn't get much more black and white than that. I digress here for now, Ben, but one observation I'll offer is that this whole situation raises the question of how we got to this point where top U.S. security and intelligence officials don't have secure mobile communication devices with software acquired by and overseen by U.S. government agencies that is totally secure for classified communications. You and I, Ben, were at last year's Billington Cybersecurity Forum in Washington, D.C., and we met with a slew of private American cyber companies who all claim that they've developed such systems. Why hasn't the government adopted those systems? My assumption is that it has to do with the very bureaucracy bogged and complex acquisition problems within the national security community, not to mention budgetary problems tied to the continuing resolution crisis that we see unfold every year with regard to Congress's authorizing of funding for those or any other acquisitions.
Well, I'll have more coming up here in just a minute about bureaucracy and contracts and acquisitions and all of that good stuff. But, I did want to. There's a lot to unpack here, of course, with this whole Signal story, and we're going to get into more of the substance in just a minute. But there's also a style aspect here to go along with that substance, and maybe I shouldn't admit this as a national security journalist, but honestly, one of the first things that jumped out to me reading the actual exchanges was the way these officials interacted and spoke to each other, and specifically their use of emojis. So we should keep this in mind here. I mean, Mike Waltz is 51, Pete Hegseth is 44, J.D. Vance is 40, Marco Rubio is 53. I'm 41. Guy, you're a few years older than I am, but there's a reason when I read these exchanges that part of it reminds me of how I talk to my friends, and sometimes, Guy, how you and I communicate on text or GChat or WhatsApp. And of course it does, because this is how people now in their 30s, 40s, and even into their 50s, and perhaps even beyond, communicate. So case in point, the emojis. Mike Waltz's message has gone viral, in which he used the fist bump, U.S. flag, and fire emojis all together when talking about the U.S. strikes against the Houthis. That one's gotten all the attention, but I personally prefer the message from Steve Witkoff, the administration's Middle East envoy, who used prayer hands, a muscle flex, and a U.S. flag when talking about those strikes. Interestingly, Witkoff is 68, so maybe this stretches, to people in their 60s and perhaps even older than that these days. It just really struck me, Guy, because this is life and death, literally. I mean, military action, the most serious issues that you can imagine. And yet parts of this conversation read like friends talking about going to the gym together or buying a few cases of beer for a 4th of July party. It's just really interesting to note the style of communication at play here.
Well, it certainly is eye-opening, Ben, and that's an interesting take. I mean, when you read the transcript of the chat, it's almost as if these top officials are just excited about being in on this secret need to know only information. Whether or not that exposes them as JV level players or something, or unqualified, that's again really political and debatable. What I would say is, let's look at what this is actually all about. It was about the Trump administration's policy of bombing Iran backed militants in Yemen, the Houthis, who've carried out missile attacks on commercial shipping for years now in the Red Sea, costing billions of dollars for global shipping companies to reroute around Africa and not use the Suez Canal. Trump's authorization to bomb the Houthis is part of the administration's push to put pressure on Iran at a moment when Israel has resumed its own military strikes on Gaza against Iran-backed Hamas there. The big question of what the administration's actual plan or policy is vis-a-vis the Houthis seems to be missed in all of this. In the actual chat, officials complain about how the Biden administration failed to crush the Houthis because it would only authorize so-called pinprick strikes against these militants. Is the Trump administration now really committed to ramping up a full-blown bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen?
No, I mean, it's hard to imagine that they would be. I mean, this is an administration and a president specifically who's made it sort of one of his foreign policy calling cards to get the U.S. out of the Middle East. So I can't imagine, regardless of what we saw in these text messages and what we saw with those strikes, that there's a long-term, years-long U.S. campaign at play here. But, speaking of trying to reduce the U.S. military footprint, there's another note on substance that we need to mention. It's clear there's a camp in the administration led by Vance and Hegseth that seem just downright angry at Europe. I mean, in these text exchanges, Vance pressed for Europe to do more to deal with the Houthis and their attacks on commercial ships. Vance said we're bailing out Europe again. Hegseth referred to it as freeloading and even called it, quote, pathetic, unquote. This is some strong language toward traditional allies, but it isn't really surprising. I mean, these two men have taken a hard line publicly toward Europe before, from Hegseth's comments publicly in Brussels that Ukraine wouldn't get all of its territory back, or Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference in which he blasted European countries and essentially admonished them about their own internal political issues and what he viewed as a crackdown on free speech across Europe. So, look, I guess in one sense, Guy, I actually appreciate what they were saying here because at least you know that their public and private feelings are in lockstep. There's no daylight, between what Hegseth and Vance, for example, say about Europe publicly and what they say about it privately when they think that no journalists are going to find out about it.
No question. It's definitely the style of President Trump and his team to open the window into their communications. I mean, we saw that with the White House imbroglio where Vance and Trump got into this public argument with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky weeks ago. It's almost as if they want to lift the veil on secrecy around sort of deep state policy machinations and how policy actually gets discussed and formed, and that may actually play to the Trump base, I think, because it contrasts dramatically with democratic administrations. But we still have the issue of sharing classified information on a commercial, albeit encrypted, a commercial messaging platform. And if you're talking about actual attack plans and like an hour by hour, this is about to happen. These are the assets that are going to be used. Hegseth has denied that there was anything classified or that any actual plans were revealed. I think this is a discussion that we haven't heard the end of. And it's interesting as well that the Democrats don't hold control over either the Senate or the House. So their ability to try and open congressional investigations is really limited right now. And I think there are a couple of Republicans talking about it. Don Bacon is one, but I don't see any congressional committee opening a major theatrical round of hearings on this. Nonetheless, I don't think we've heard the end of it.
No, we certainly haven't. And look, I mean, this is a hot topic behind the scenes. I can tell you in off-the-record conversations with people here at the AUSA Global Force Symposium, people are talking about this, and that's not surprising. One more word about the AUSA Global Force Symposium. It's a fascinating gathering here. Just lots of Army personnel, the defense industry, all the big players to smaller firms. I've written here about the Army's plan to field human-machine integrated formations, about how 3D printing will transform the way the Army repairs its vehicles and weapons in the field. And I even got a breakdown of the future of the Humvee. So there's going to be more content coming from the AUSA convention on this week's show and as well as next week's show. But for now, let's get to our interview with AUSA President, retired General Robert Brooks Brown. And we are joined now by retired General Robert Brooks Brown. He's the president of the Association of the United States Army and formerly the commanding general of U.S. Army Pacific. General Brown, thank you so much for joining us here.
No, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me, Ben.
Of course. So we are at, of course, the AUSA Global Force Symposium this week. And I want to start with that and ask you, what's sort of the mission statement, if you will, of this conference? What do you want me and all the folks who are here to take away from it this week?
Yeah, no, great question. Really, we get at educate, inform, and connect as the Army's association. And really, there's tremendous educational programs going on that are really needed on how we can make sure our warfighters have the best equipment, they have the best knowledge, and so when you look, that's a key part of it. And then connecting, we were just looking at connecting industry with the military, and you would think, well, that's not that hard, but really. It needs to be, if you want our military to have the best equipment, have the best chance of deterring any adversaries, we have to be closely linked with industry because they just do an amazing job of very rapidly, adjusting. The nature of war hasn't changed, but the character of war has changed so much and more rapidly now than ever before in history.
Right.
What used to take years is days now of, change, and you just watch people adjusting. So if you're not connected with industry, Department of Defense alone couldn't do it.
Yeah.
The industry has to help from small, startup type to the big defense companies. They have to really help to ensure we can provide the security needed and meet the challenges for our nation. And God forbid, if we have to go to war, we can win.
What's the pace of change been like watching it from your perch over the past couple of years? Because we're just seeing like we're in this exponential period of growth and technology.
It's fascinating. I was involved in innovation my whole career, and actually, at one point I did the test evaluation of a whole new system, the Stryker Brigade, and the most digitized brigade in the Army. It was amazing. And I thought we were going at a fast pace then, back in 2002.
Yeah.
And it was the snail's pace compared to today. There's no comparison. Things move so rapidly. It's the greatest in history by far. And people would argue that. They'd say, well, go back to the Civil War and the telegraph information rule, but it didn't disseminate rapidly. Now, a text can change policy. And, just rapidly, people just think something happens, and all around the world, people are tuned in, and things are changing and adjusting almost instantly. It's amazing. And you see the exact same in leveraging technology. Something's not going to be successful if it's working against an adversary for very long, because they'll adjust and they get a vote in it, and more rapidly than ever. I use we had a tough scenario with Korea a few years ago, back 2017, 2018, when, North Korea was really acting up. And I look at, without technology, it used to take us a year to really develop like a target array of, some, God forbid, again, if we had to go to war or they attacked, and how we would stop them. And leveraging technology, that went down to a day, and so it's amazing what technology has done, how rapidly it's changed things.
The folks who served under you in the Army, do you get the sense, are they willing to sort of trust some of these technological advances? For example, yesterday I was at a panel discussion about human-machine integrated formations. Yeah. So if you're, God forbid, in a combat scenario, do you feel like soldiers, I can trust this robot to go out here and do the job?
Young guys, no problem. I count young, I'm an old retired guy now, I count young, like 40 and younger. They have no problem. They've lived that. They've grown up. They're digital natives. They trust the technology. It's old guys like me that tend to be, well, I don't know, and slow them down. Yeah. We often need to get out of the way, and they'll speed it up even more and trust it even more. And I think they definitely trust it. I kind of joke, sometimes over-rely on it. I look at, before we had the technology, and we had to do some basic mundane things like navigation without GPS.
Or math.
Yeah, exactly. I would joke with these young guys that, they'd go right off a cliff using their, navigation and GPS on their phone. They'd walk right off a cliff. They have no idea how to do it. and then they have to learn that.
Yeah.
How do you, if you don't have the technology, if it's degraded, how do you still perform? But they're very comfortable with it. They leverage it. They think of things that older folks don't think of because it's very natural to them.
So if I grew up in rural Pennsylvania and I used to know how to get everywhere, within a 100-mile radius, I could get there without looking at a map.
Yeah.
And then I lived in D.C. for 12 years as GPS came on board. 12 years in, still couldn't get downtown to a building without looking at my phone.
Yeah,
looking at my GPS.
exactly.
It's because your mind kind of gets rewired to rely on this stuff.
Exactly, no doubt. Yeah.
I want to talk to you about money, of course, funding.
Okay.
We just averted a government shutdown, of course, on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
But look, when I talk to folks in the services, of course, they want funding certainty, knowing what to expect.
Yeah.
So what's the impact of this CRs, budget uncertainty, not knowing, political fights over spending? What does that impact have on the Army and the companies?
That's a great topic. And it's one of our main focuses is getting over to Congress and please, give them a budget that they can, is predictable, and you save money. The CR wastes taxpayer dollars because, you have to pay more. Instead of having a longer term contract, you can get cheaper. They'll charge you much more for the short-term CR. You can't start anything new, so it really hampers, getting the best equipment and technology to soldiers in the military, and it costs a lot. It wastes a lot of money, and it really is. I mean, on one hand, I'm glad they passed it. A shutdown's worse, obviously, but a CR is still a huge challenge and waste of money, and they need to get a predictable budget where they can best ensure taxpayer dollars are spent wisely as needed. And unfortunately, a continuing resolution wastes a lot of money, and it's a shame just to keep basic things going.
Yeah.
And again, the lack of, as we just mentioned, the rapid change, and now you're saying you can't start anything new. Well, how can you make sure you can adequately protect our nation if you can't start anything new and it's changing all the time?
Yeah.
So the CR is better than a shutdown, but we need a predictable budget, and I sure wish they could pass one in a timely manner. We all do.
Are you worried,
better?
Even more broadly speaking, is if there's a climate of budget cuts and downsizing in the federal government? I don't want to get into DOGE and all the specifics around that, but the Trump administration has talked about potential, defense budget cuts. Are you worried about that?
Well, yeah, worried. It always is a concern. Of course, you want to save taxpayers money, and you want to be, and I'm sure there's savings in Department of Defense, of course, everywhere, any organization you can go to, find the savings. Absolutely. That's smart. But we still, sometimes, you have to spend to protect, the nation, and it's got to be a priority. What security versus savings? Security's got to be, you have to have security.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I wish I could say it's a time when you can afford to cut in security because it's a safe world. Well, it's just the opposite. I'd say in my 40 years in service, I've never seen such a dangerous time because you have 4 countries working together, kind of an axis of evil that is very bad. They're working together: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And they're working closely together. For God's sakes, there's North Koreans fighting in Ukraine for Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very dangerous time when they're working together. They're not working to ensure liberty and freedom around the world. They want authoritarian, and freedom's their biggest enemy.
Yeah.
So, that's dangerous. So but could we be wiser? Could we? Of course. And should we look for every savings possible? Absolutely. I think that's smart.
I remember General Milley a couple of years ago testifying on Capitol Hill and saying, if you all are worried about the defense budget now, God, you'll have to double it if we find ourselves in a war against
nothing would be worse.
Right.
Yeah. Look at what's spent on wars, and war is a terrible thing, and no one wants a war. So we want to be able to spend so we can deter. And these folks that want to do us harm, they're watching. They know. And you don't want to leave them, hey, if they're not deterred, if it looks like there's an opening, that's a very bad thing. And that's when you get, they're going to invade somewhere, and an innocent country like Ukraine.
Yeah.
And, so you've got to have the deterrence for sure.
Are we, not to get too far off track here, but since you mentioned sort of the axis of tyrannies or autocrats or whatever you want to call it, how hard is it for the U.S. to compete against a country like China that has such top-down structure in terms of their military, industrial, political?
It's very interesting because, originally I would have thought the internet and the information age would disadvantage, a communist and authoritarian regime because people would get the truth. And you figure, what's kind of happened is it actually is an advantage for them because they can control what people get more than I ever imagined. They can
Yeah.
control the internet, and not only control it, but provide disinformation to them, so they believe the lies. And so it's made it very, very difficult. What is the truth? And so you look at that, and it's a real challenge. And I think no doubt that freedom is just priceless. And I think for us, allies and partners working together and cooperating, that's the advantage we have over the authoritarian regimes. That yes, I mentioned the four that are working together, but they're not working anywhere near as close as we are with our allies and partners, and not the relationships like of a NATO or the incredible partnerships and alliances in the Pacific. 5 of our 7 alliances are in the Pacific, and so that's key.
Yeah. So from an Army perspective, of course, the DoD always talks about China being the pacing challenge, or the pacing threat to the United States. What does that look like through the prism of the Army? What is the pacing challenge from the Army's perspective?
It's the same. And what's interesting is there's this huge, myth out there that, the Pacific has got a lot of water, and so it's a naval and air theater. You don't need the Army. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Unfortunately, China and others that would do us harm have read our playbook. And, they've looked at how we fight, and they developed anti-access aerial denial systems that keep the air and maritime forces a long ways away from China. If you look, we used to be right there inside the first island chain, no problem. Now it's, 3,000 miles where you get close, and those assets, if they try to fight alone, would be defeated. Well, we don't fight alone, we fight joint. And the Army is key, and the land is critical. I would say Army, Marines, and Special Forces that can occupy land. Just like in World War II, we had 21 divisions, 20,000 soldiers, 21 of those divisions in the Pacific to secure land to get closer to affect our adversary, Japan. You couldn't bomb unless you got closer, you didn't have the range. Well, now you have to have the land to get close enough to impact China. And if you can't get closer, they know that, and again, that's a dangerous situation. They're very aggressive. I've worked, many years, over 30 years with China, and I've seen, that they used to fear us and respect us. In my opinion, they don't fear us anymore.
Really?
Yeah, but it's a false
militarily, or
militarily. Yeah. It's a false optimism that they feel they're better than they are, and they respect us still. But they don't fear us. And a little bit of fear is good to keep them from doing something stupid. And I worry about an accidental conflict. No one would want a conflict with China. It'd be crazy.
Yeah.
But they're being so aggressive, you can have an accidental conflict because of their aggressiveness. And I've seen it from where, 15 years ago, they wouldn't show you any of their high-level equipment at all. They'd show you only old stuff. Now, I was there, 5 years ago, they showed us all their new stuff, and we're bragging about it. And so we have to have the ability to deter. And in the Pacific, the pacing item is China, and then you have, of course, Russia and the concerns in Europe. But in the Pacific, you have to have land. It has to be a joint fight. There's a lot of water. It's a combined joint fight, I would tell you. That means our allies and partners with us.
And a multi-domain fight as well.
Yeah, exactly. Multi-domain is the future.
Right.
It is absolutely the future. The air-land battle was incredibly effective before. People have figured out how to overcome that. Multi-domain is the next level. Joint to a level never before seen. Working together, integrated. It doesn't matter whose sensor it is, what service.
On that note, do you sense that the Army's modernization strategy is on track by
That's right on
2035 to be the multi-domain force? And we can talk about long-range precision fires and next-gen combat vehicles.
They did an amazing job about 8 years ago, really looking at getting rid of programs we didn't need and looking at the future concept. And it was really well done. It was what they called the night court. They got rid of a lot of stuff. But then they set 6 priorities: long-range precision fires and network. You go on future combat view, et cetera, soldier lethality. As they looked at these priorities, they have maintained them now. They're on their 3rd chief of staff, new administration, and they're the right spot on priorities. If you look at what's happened in Ukraine, you look at everything, everybody's studying. It's an amazingly accurate and exactly what is needed to deter an adversary, and God forbid, if needed, fight and win if we're out there anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it's spot on, and it needs to remain. There's rumors now of, cut the Army, which has happened historically. get a smaller Army, cut the Army program, that'd be very foolish because they are the linchpin of the joint force. They're the key. And it has to be a joint force. And the land is where you can get inside and make a difference. And I would tell you that our adversaries know that.
Yeah.
And that will deter them and prevent a conflict. And so, as you mentioned earlier, much better to spend the money to prevent than, God forbid, have to go to war. Who in their right mind would ever want to go to war? It's terrible.
Yeah.
But if we should have to go to war, we don't want to come in second. We've got to win. And so it's a joint, combined, multi-domain, all domains involved. I found in commanding and working multi-domain and joint task force, that would be something we'd leverage if, God forbid, we did have to go to war.
Mm-hmm.
If you did anything in a single domain, you failed. It had to be combined, multiple domains, presenting multiple dilemmas to an enemy. And like before, if I was in Iraq, say I was a Stryker Brigade commander in Iraq, I'm on the streets of Mosul, I could rely on the Air Force to put a JDAM through the window, and they had the capability. I didn't, no problem. Well, against a near peer, you have to have multiple ability to disrupt them and throw them off in multi-domain from multiple domains.
Yeah.
And again, that's what the Army's multi-domain task force does. Better, nobody else has anything like it. That's what, as we're training in multi-domain operations, all the services are seeing. And those priorities you mentioned from the Army are spot on and have been proven to be exactly what's needed. No doubt, and hopefully to prevent, to deter.
Okay.
That's for sure.
General, last thing to wrap up here. I want to ask you about the Golden Dome initiative.
Yeah.
How critical do you think that is for U.S. homeland defense right now, and how realistic do you think it is?
Yeah, I look at it, I look back to when people thought, that missile and air defense was impossible to get the systems working together. Patriot was developed separately, of THAAD, of the Navy systems. They were all developed separately. And then I actually lived in the Pacific, pulling all those together to prevent missiles from Korea, and watched that in the very beginning when we were working that. And it's a joint thing. It's all services involved. And we stop and shoot down those missiles. And so it was tough pulling systems together.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Golden Dome and the idea of the Iron Dome concept and protecting, it is really pulling a lot of systems together for all the services. But it's exactly what I've been talking about. You're going to need total joint cooperation, figuring it out. It's not going to be easy, but we've got the experts and we have the technology more than ever before with artificial intelligence that will assist. They'll figure it out and they'll be able to do it and protect our homeland, I believe. But it's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
But it's going to take an investment, and it's going to take a serious effort, combined and joint together, working together, all the services in all domains. Space has got to work with ground, has got to work with the sea to prevent any holes in this protection. There's going to be holes out there. They're going to have to figure out how to solve. But I believe they will be able to figure it out if they have the right emphasis and effort. It's a challenge, but we can do it. We've done it before with other systems, and I think it's something. I think it's actually, we have to do it. Protecting homeland has got to be number one.
Yep. And
there are more and more devious ways that people can, come after and harm us here. We're no longer protected by two oceans a long ways away. We don't have to worry about it. We have to worry about it. Cyber attack can go anywhere and really disrupt things and cause major problems. So all that has to be considered. I think they'll be able to do it.
Okay. General Brown, thank you so much for joining us here on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks for having me, and enjoyed it.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. And Guy, my threat of the week is continuing budget resolutions and budget uncertainty, building off of something that General Brown just said. I've been hearing a lot about this at the AUSA Global Force Symposium this week. We just heard General Brown say it's a waste of money, literally, CRs, continuing resolutions, because defense companies do, in fact, want more money for shorter contracts and less certainty. And I mean, it's like everything else, right? You can go on your phone right now and download 1 million apps with a subscription model, and a month is cheaper than a week, and a full year is cheaper than a month. Similar concepts at play here with big money defense contracts. As a matter of fact, I got the sense talking to some defense company executives this week that they'd actually be okay with a slight reduction in defense spending if the trade-off is an actual budget so they can plan at least a few years into the future. A lot of these companies, of course, do have multiple year or even multi-decade contracts with the DoD or DHS or other agencies, but still, when the threat of a shutdown is constantly looming, it makes things much more complicated. I think there's an expectation in the defense industry, at least a hope, that the Trump administration and Congress will finally change that dynamic over the summer as the next round of budget talks heats up. But until then, Guy, it's my threat of the week.
Interesting, Ben. My threat of the week is that U.S. intelligence communications are dangerously exposed to U.S. adversary spy networks, especially if those communications are being carried out on platforms like Signal. How is it even possible that we're having this conversation in 2025, basically a decade after the whole mess surrounding former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server for sensitive comms, and years of evidence of Russia-backed hacking of U.S. political servers? It's mind-boggling. I think the big question for our listeners to consider is, does the U.S. government need to partner quickly with private industry to adopt and implement a more secure mobile communication system for top-level intel and national security officials to chat about classified information? And does Congress need to demand that and fund it?
Maybe so. And look, you and I both know that there would be a long line of dozens or maybe even hundreds of companies who would be more than happy to provide that kind of service, that kind of secure communications channel for federal officials. So we'll see where that goes. Thank you for that. A huge thanks to retired General Robert Brooks Brown for that great interview, and for everybody at AUSA for making me feel so at home this week. And a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, share this podcast with all of your friends. Hit that subscribe button. Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.